I'm gonna read the description because I know you won't. Here is the introduction to this video series. By the way, when I say Deleuze, I mean Deleuze and Guattari. This video series will take you through my reading of Yoshiyuki Sato's Power and Resistance, which I don't see many people talking about, unfortunately. This is not a video essay. It will not be entertaining and edited like my other videos. It is already a lot of work understanding the text and then trying to communicate it. This is an educational video series for anyone curious about French Marxism. I will turn Sato's analysis into a video essay about living an unalienated life in the future, but for now I will apply his analysis. I will not apply his analysis. Rather, I will convey it directly to the viewer, page by page. Always keep in mind that this is my interpretation of the text. I aim to either 1. Speed up the reading for future readers by explaining and contextualizing the text, or communicate Yoshiyuki Sato's Power and Resistance second hand. In part 1, I will talk about the preface, introduction, Kant, and Nietzsche, obviously in relation to Foucault. Again, we're talking about French theory here. Okay, so immediately I see Butler's name. Yes, that Judith Butler, the Zionist. I read a bit of her precarious life and used it as an example in my writing of how the ideology of non-violence obscures and hides the mechanisms of capitalism. She does not support anti-colonialist violence. Anyway, let's move on. The conversation around 60s, 70s philosophy seems tired, but this book says otherwise. Sato establishes a relationship between Foucault and Deleuze/Guattari and Derrida and Althusser. We'll purely be focusing on Foucault and Deleuze for this video series. The relationship we are concerned with is power and resistance, the title of the book. Foucault is the analysis of power, domination. Deleuze, however, tells us how to resist, creating true difference within power, dividing it and overcoming it. By the way, Freud's death drive here is essential to the synthesis of psychoanalysis and structuralism/French theory, also Lacan, but we're not gonna be getting into that too much. I don't really understand what the other is in relation to structuralism. An active passivity or going beyond passivity can create resistance, and resistance is not one singular thing or action. We are in the age of the constant reproduction of power, and we must ask, is there a Marxist future? Okay, so I don't really think you can really understand this preface without reading the book or having a background knowledge of all these philosophical concepts. So I guess the preface isn't really that significant. We'll move on to the introduction. The chapter defines structuralism by opening with Foucault giving a lecture about rereading texts, reinterpreting them, thereby keeping them alive. Lacan interrupts and says, 1. Structuralism does not negate the subject under capitalism. It does not negate power. It is a theory of power, of the subject, not a theory of resistance. 2. The subject's existence depends on something foundational or elementary in Lacan's words. That foundation is also external, so it's not your innate reason or consciousness that makes up the subject under capitalism. It's something outside of you, like power and society. Let's talk about point 1. Structuralism's theory of the subject also destroys previous theories while creating its own theory. Previous theories take the subject for granted, e.g. asking what happens when we observe things rather than what influences how we observe things. Now for point 2, what is this foundation that Lacan says the subject depends on? It is a signifier. If you don't know about signs, Basically, the signifier is a representation of an object, an image of a tree, or the word tree. That representation signifies in your brain the concept of a tree. So Lacan says the subject is dependent on a signifier of lack, or an origin of desire. Desire is lack because you desire something because, well, you lack it. Deleuze, however, disagrees that desire is lack. In Lacanian psychoanalysis, you are made up of desires, of lacks, of nothing. You're made up of nothing, and there is an origin of this nothing, perhaps a nothing of nothing. But let's move on from Lacan. Structuralism asks, how does one internalize power and thereby form the capitalist subject? We can look at Freud for an answer. We sometimes form attachments to objects, so some part of the object is internalized within us. We are then defined by an outside object. Structuralism substitutes power for the object. We internalize power in place of the object. That is what is foundational, as Lacan said, for the formation of the subject. So going back to the theory of power / the subject, this book aims to create a theory of resistance by transforming structuralism. It is a theory of power which can change power rather than merely analyzing it. It is a question of how to overcome our internalized capitalism. We now go back to the beginning. We need to reinterpret structuralism to transform it. Also, why isn't Hegel mentioned? This is clearly very Hegelian in that it's transforming something from the inside, Hegel's internal contradiction. You can't just come in and say a thing is stupid. You have to prove why that thing contradicts itself and is thus stupid. Anyway, theory of resistance. This theory obviously opposes theories, i.e. psychoanalysis, that say the subject depends on something, is formed by something. We must redefine the subject, so to speak. Now let's go back to Freud's internalization of objects. Freud calls it the introjection of objects into our ego. We identify with an object when we form an attachment to it. And when we lose it, we lose a part of ourselves. And we also hate ourselves for losing that thing. An ego and a superego is formed. The superego hates the ego, you hate yourself, for losing the object. It regulates and disciplines the ego, you regulate and punish yourself. Also, the superego is parental authority, regulating and disciplining the ego. Note here that we're not talking about the object. We're talking about an internalized object. The object inside of your mind, not the actual object. Now, this superego criticizing you for losing the object is almost like the object criticizing you, isn't it? Your superego is the lost object. But ultimately, it all comes down to you placing significance and identifying with the object. Power. We also identify with power. Power disciplines us. We follow the norms of society, like going to work. And like the object, power is only significant because we say so. The rest of the introduction outlines the text. You can read it if you want, but I doubt you'll understand it. Okay, so in summary, we have to overcome the subject, overcome power. That is to say, we have to overcome theories of power and the subject. And those theories say that power is internalized within us. So we have to overcome those mechanisms of internalization. We now begin chapter 1. How people conceived of power during the time of structuralism, again the 60s and 70s, was thought of as repressive, purely negative and alienating. This conception of power originates from Marx, particularly alienation, and power oppresses the, quote, original nature of the subject, unquote, which I don't really know what that means. maybe the original nature is like primitive communism, or our ability to reason. Anyway, structuralism basically says, well, no, power also produces. After all, I mean, capitalism is a system of production as well as repression, so yeah. Power produces and reproduces. By the way, this word reproduce is very important for most political philosophy or theory. For example, it reproduces subjects. It produces subjects based on mechanisms of power or dispositives. Sato says dispositives are, for Althusser, ideological state apparatuses. For Foucault, disciplinary power. For Deleuze, Oedipus. Deleuze describes Foucault's dispositives as knowledge, so line of sight and, quote, utterances, unquote. Power, lines of force, and subjectivity, that's from Deleuze's What is a Dispositive, 1992. So I'll refer to dispositives as mechanisms of power from now on. Okay, so page 14, really confusing. First of all, it talks about formalism and structuralism, which is also forms of literary analysis. Formalism is the analysis of the form and beauty of the text, and structuralism is analysis of society's underlying structures in relation to the text. So the text in context to society. But perhaps this book is talking about how the subject is used as an object and how objects like power structures form reality or truth. So my interpretation of page 14 is the following. If subjects depend on power/objects, factors outside of our consciousness, if subjects are defined by their reproduction of power, by, for example, following norms and affirming social structures, then how can the subject overcome power? It can't, obviously. The very way we formulated the equation negates all resistance. We need a, quote, new concept of the subject, unquote. Again, going back to the introduction, how structuralism is not a theory of resistance. So before going into Kant, let's summarize. Power mechanisms and theories of power produce subjects and structures, and the very way we formulate subjects negates resistance. In chapter 1.1, we understand Kant's conception of the subject and Foucault's critique of it. First, we are introduced to a complicated phrase, empirical transcendental doublet. We can ignore the doublet part, that's just saying there is both an empirical and transcendental part of subjectivity. Basically, it's a restatement. So, what is the empirical and transcendental? Basically, it's the, quote, object of knowledge, unquote, and the, quote, subject who knows, unquote. What does this mean? Let's look at Kant. The empirical is intuition, so a thought or observation that is immediate, intuitive, simple, abstract. So, for example, a rock has such and such features. In Kant's words, it's the subject of thought, so a subject who thinks and observes things, basically. Now, the transcendental is more complex. It's inner thinking, inner reflection. Basically, you're observing yourself as if you were an object, thinking of your feelings and senses like touch and smell. It's awareness of yourself and your observations in the world, your senses. A crucial concept is turning your intuitive observations, so like touch and sight, into concepts in your inner thoughts. Notice also how we can only observe representations of the object, the texture of it, the color of it, the smell of it, etc. And Kant says this is all knowledge can do. Interpret these representations. We observe things, we interpret them and turn them into concepts. That's it. That's all of knowledge. But what is this interpretation process? This process turned multiple observations into a single concept. It unifies all these characteristics of an object into one concept. So the smell and look of shit combine into the single concept of shit. Kant says thought unifies the observed world and God. Our mode of knowledge, our mode of interpretation is above our immediate observations. The observations serve to formulate concepts, hence why thinking is transcendental. The process also separates our mode of thinking from our environment, from the outside. There's an inside of thought and the outside of things. The object is reproduced within us as a concept. In other words, we internalize the object by turning it into a thought. Freud. So to recap, the Kantian subject is first empirical, observational, and then they are transcendental, turning those empirical observations into abstract concepts through some internal process. This is a very limiting view of the subject and of the world. There is a field of knowledge, and knowledge is limited to this process. The world is, quote, folded down, unquote, in simple concepts. Foucault also says something interesting here. The impossible of knowledge appears on their, quote, blank sides, unquote. So Foucault is kind of saying what is left unsaid is more important. Heidegger says man cannot grasp things in themselves. Again, our observations are representations. So man is limited in their knowledge. Kant asks 3 questions in his critiques. 1. What can I know? So basically our ability to reason. 2. What should I do? So practical, useful reason. 3. What may I hope? So our judgment of the world, I guess. All these questions relate to one central question. What is man? Man asks all these questions precisely because we lack things and answers and we are limited. God, the infinite and perfect substance, would not ask any of these questions. He is infinite. Heidegger says that man asks these questions so that we are certain we are limited and then confine ourselves in this finitude. He also says that the concept of being is always forgotten and rediscovered again through people like Kant. Foucault comes in and says, as he does, okay, so but what about power relations? Why are we repressing the outside world by considering our ability to reason? Not everything is a singular, homogeneous concept, Kant. There's differences, complexities, and relationships between things and the world. And now we get to Nietzsche. Chapter 1.2 contextualizes our ability to reason, our subjectivity within power relations. Okay, so this subject of knowledge, this subject who thinks, doesn't just randomly pop into the world. The foundations of knowledge have a history. The subject has a history. These things came out of a process of society. As Nietzsche said, ideals are fabricated. So there's no natural origin of our metaphysical beliefs. They are invented. So we don't identify with the thing we're observing and internalize it because knowledge is invented by us, for us. So we don't know things, it's all socially constructed, as people today would say. Nietzsche says we have many drives that struggle between each other, synthesizing in our pursuit of knowledge. For example, the drive to laughter or to hatred. Knowledge is thus a will to destroy and dominate the object rather than identifying and internalizing it. Foucault comes in again and says again, okay, so what about power? Aren't these drives that form your will actually just social power? Knowledge is thus an effect of power. Sato says, quote, for Foucault, knowledge is a historical result and an event produced in social relations, unquote. And if there are these mechanisms of power at play when we observe and gain knowledge, then that instant where we gain knowledge is a result of multiple factors, not just a simple intuition, as Kant said. The subject is a vessel for power. In the 38th footnote, it says that transgressing our culture discovers and recomposes the emptiness of the sacred. So now let's get into how Foucault is a theory of power and not of resistance. Chapter 1.3 opens with Foucault's concept of power. Foucault says power is a result of many internal struggles between different forces, and what he means by an inversion of power is that power is no longer concentrated at the top, it's everywhere. The internal struggles of power also pose a question. How can resistance be external to this internal struggle of power? There's also a reference to Marcuse's Great Refusal here. Resistance must not be singular since power is not singular and homogeneous. Foucault says resistance is not always within the internal struggles of power. Okay, so how can resistance escape power, Foucault? We don't really know. He just says that. Sato here brings up the panopticon, where power is perfect and there is no resistance. I am 99% sure you understand the panopticon, it's very famous. I'll just mention some things here. In the panopticon, the goal is to see without being seen. As I mentioned in my video essay, Totalitarian Capitalism and Resistance, this also applies to warfare, according to Busquets' The Eye of War. It is to see the enemy, kill them without being seen yourself. So America has these surveillance technologies and such to bomb Middle Eastern families. Also, the subject knows that it is being seen, which reminds me of Zizek's famously quoted someone. I forgot. He quoted someone. Quote, "We know that we are doing it, and yet we're still doing it." This quote was popularized by capitalist realism. We're continuing to do capitalism, and despite how bad capitalism is, despite the fact that we know capitalism is bad, we're still doing capitalism. And obviously the surveillance of the panopticon is inside of our head, like Freud's superego regulating the ego, if you recall. It's this transcendental ego regulating the empirical ego, going back to Kant. Sato says Foucault's history of sexuality provides the possibility for resistance in the empirical instant, while discipline and punish is transcendental and provides no possibility for resistance. Again, there's this higher authority, disciplinary power, regulating you. So a multiple, immediate bodily experience where resistance is possible, and a higher, unified, disciplinary authority where resistance is not possible. Here is precisely the contradiction in Foucault that he needs to resolve. And with that, we'll end off. Next time, we'll read chapter 2. To summarize, we need to go beyond structuralism into a theory of resistance. Power is productive and repressive. Kant's subject is limited and ignores the outside world and the circumstances knowledge is in. Foucault brings Nietzsche into Kant and redefines the subject and defines power. But these definitions do not allow for resistance.
Our fastest and hardest boner, quickest speed for getting a boner. All right, thanks, guys.
Мичманы и не мичманы, дорогие С праздником, дорогие друзья! И не мичманы. Дорогие друзья! Спасибо за внимание.